Hello, Alice. This is a story for you. I'm your great uncle Jonathan, and I'm going to try to tell you a story called Elsie Piddock Skips in Her Sleep by a lady called Eleanor Farjeon, with pictures by Charlotte Volk. When I was a boy, there used to be a man on the radio who would tell stories to children. Every story he would begin with the words, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." Elsie Piddock Skips in Her Sleep by Eleanor Farjeon. Elsie Piddock lived in Glynde under Caburn, where lots of other little girls lived too. They lived mostly on bread and butter because their mothers were too poor to buy cake. As soon as Elsie began to hear, she heard other little girls skipping every evening after school in the lane outside her mother's cottage. Swish, swish went the rope through the air. Tappity tap went the little girls' feet on the ground. Mumble, umble, umble went the children's voices, saying a rhyme that the skipper could skip to. In the course of time, Elsie not only heard the sounds, but understood what they were all about. And then the mumble, umble, umble turned into words like this: Andy, spandy, sugary candy, French almond rock. Bread and butter for your supper, all your mother's got. The second bit went twice as fast as the first bit. And when the little girls said it, Elsie Piddock, munching her supper, always munched her mouthful of bread and butter in double quick time. She wished she had some sugary candy French almond rock to suck during the first bit, but she never had. When Elsie Piddock was 3 years old, she asked her mother for a skipping rope. "You're too little," said her mother. "Bide a bit till you're a bigger girl, then you shall have one." Elsie pouted and said no more. But in the middle of the night, her parents were wakened by something going slap, slap on the floor, and there was Elsie in her nightgown, skipping with her father's braces. She skipped till her feet caught in the tail of them, and then she tumbled down and cried. But she had skipped 10 times running first. "Bless my buttons, mother," said Mr. Piddock, "the child's a born skipper." And Mrs. Piddock jumped out of bed, full of pride, rubbed Elsie's elbows for her, and said, "There's a there now, dry your tears, and tomorrow you shall have a skip rope all of your own." So Elsie dried her eyes on the hem of her nightgown, and in the morning, before he went to work, Mr. Piddock got a little cord just the right length and made 2 little wooden handles to go on the ends. With this, Elsie skipped all day, scarcely stopping to eat her breakfast of bread and butter and her dinner of bread and butter. And in the evening, when the school children were gathered in the lane, Elsie went out among them. And began to skip with the best. "Oh!" cried Joan Challen, who was the champion skipper. "Just look at little Elsie Piddock skipping as never so!" All the skippers stopped to look, and then to wonder. Elsie Piddock certainly did skip as never so, and they called to their mothers to come and see. And their mothers in the lane came to their doors and threw up their hands and cried, "Little Elsie Piddock is a born skipper." By the time she was 5, she could outskip any of them, whether in Andy Spandy, or Lady, Lady, Drop Your Purse, or Charlie Parley Stole Some Barley, or whichever of the games it might be. By the time she was 6, her name and fame were known to all the villages in the county, and by the time she was 7, the fairies had heard of her. They were fond of skipping themselves, and they had a special skipping master who taught them new skips. His name was Andy Spandy. And he taught them new skips every month at the new moon. And as they skipped, they chanted, "The high skip, the sly skip, the skip like a feather, the long skip, the strong skip, the skip all together, the slow skip, the toe skip, the skip double double, the fast skip, the last skip, and skip against trouble." All these skips had their own meanings, and they were made up by the skipping master, whose name was Andy Spandy. And he was very proud of his fairies, because they skipped better than the fairies of any other county. But he was also very severe with them if they did not please him. One night he scolded Fairy Heels-a-Lead for skipping badly, and praised Fairy Fleafoot for skipping well. Then Fairy Heels-of-Lead sniffed and snuffed and said, "There's a little girl in Glynde who could skip Fleafoot round the moon and back again. A born skipper she is, and she skips as never so." "What is her name?" asked Andy Spandy. "Her name is Elsie Piddock, and she has skipped down every village far and near from Diddling to Wonnock." "Go and fetch her here," commanded Andy Spandy. And off went Heels-a-Lead and poked her head through Elsie's little window under the eaves, crying, "Elsie Piddock, Elsie Piddock." "There's a skipping match on Caburn, and Fairy Fleafoot says she can skip better than you." Elsie Piddock was fast asleep, but the words got into her dream. So she hopped out of bed with her eyes closed, and took her skip rope, and followed Heels-a-Lead to the top of Mount Caburn, where Andy Spandy and the fairies were waiting for them. "Skip, Elsie Piddock," said Andy Spandy, "and show us what you're worth." Elsie twirled her rope and skipped in her sleep, and as she skipped, she murmured. Andy Spandy, sugary candy, French almond rock, bread and butter for your supper, all your mother's got. Andy Spandy watched her skipping with his eyes as sharp as needles, but he could find no fault with it, nor could the fairies. Very good, as far as it goes, said Andy Spandy. Now let's see how far it does go. Stand forth, Elsie and Fleafoot, for the long skip. Elsie had never done the long skip before, and if she had had all her wits about her, she wouldn't have known what Andy Spandy meant. But as she was dreaming, she understood him perfectly. So she twirled her rope, and as it came over, jumped as far along the ground as she could, about 12 feet along the ground from where she had stepped. Then Fleafoot did the long skip and skipped clean out of sight. Said Andy Pandy. Now, Elsie Piddock, let's see you do the strong skip. Once more Elsie understood what was wanted. She put both her feet together, jumped her rope, and came down with all her strength, so that her heels sank into the ground. Then Fleafoot did the strong skip and sank into the ground as deep as her waist. Said Andy Spandy. And now, Elsie Piddock, let us see you do the skip all together. At his words, all the fairies leaped to their ropes and began skipping as lively as they could, Elsie with them. An hour went by, 2 hours, and 3 hours. One by one the fairies fell down exhausted, and Elsie Piddock skipped on. Just before morning she was skipping all by herself. Then Andy Spandy wagged his head and said, Elsie Piddock, you are a born skipper. There's no tiring you at all. And for that you shall come once a month to Caburn when the moon is new, and I will teach you to skip till a year is up. And after that I'll wager there won't be a mortal or fairy to touch you. Andy Spandy was good as his word. 12 times during the next year Elsie Piddock rose up in her sleep with the new moon and went to the top of Mount Caburn. There she took her place among the fairies and learned to do all the tricks of the skipping rope, until she did them better than any. At the end of the year, she did the high skip so well that she skipped right over the moon. In the sly skip, not a fairy could catch her or know where she would skip to next. So artful was she that she could skip through the lattice of a skeleton leaf and never break it. She redoubled the skip double-double, in which you only had to double yourself up twice round the skipping rope before it came down, and Elsie Piddock did it 4 times. In the fast skip, she skipped so fast you couldn't see her, though she stood on the same spot all the time. In the last skip, when all the fairies skipped over the same rope in turn, round and round and round and round, till they made a mistake from giddiness, Elsie never got giddy and never made a mistake, and was always left in last. In the slow skip, she skipped so slow that a mole had time to throw up a molehill under her rope before she came down. In the toe skip. When all the others skipped on their tiptoes, Elsie never touched a grass blade with more than the edge of her toenail. In the skip against trouble, she skipped so joyously that Andy Spandy himself chuckled with delight. In the long skip, she skipped from Caburn to the other end of Sussex, and had to be fetched back by the wind. In the strong skip, she went right under the earth as a diver goes under the sea, and the rabbits whose burrows she had disturbed handed her back up again. But in the skip like a feather, she came down like a gossamer, so that she could alight on a spider thread and never shake the dewdrop off it. And in the skip altogether, she could skip down the whole tribe of fairies and remain as fresh as a daisy. Nobody had ever found out how long Elsie Piddock could skip without getting tired, for everybody else got tired first, and even Andy Spandy didn't know. At the end of the year, he said to her, "Elsie Piddock, I have taught you all. Bring me your skipping rope, and you shall have a prize." Elsie gave her rope to Andy Spandy, and he licked the two wooden handles, the first one and then the other. When he handed the rope back to her, one of the handles was made of sugar candy, the other of French almond rock. "There," said Andy Spandy, "though you suck them never so, they will never grow less, and you shall therefore suck sweet all your life. And as long as you are little enough to skip with this rope, you shall skip as I have taught you. But when you are too big for this rope, and must get a new one, you will no longer be able to do all the fairy skips that you have learned, although you will still skip better in the mortal way than any other girl that was ever born. Goodbye, Elsie Piddock." "Aren't I ever going to skip for you again?" asked Elsie Piddock in her sleep. But Andy Spandy didn't answer, for the morning had come over the downs, and the fairies disappeared, and Elsie Piddock went back to bed. If Elsie had been famous for skipping before this fairy year, you can imagine what she became after it. She created so much wonder that she hardly dared show all she could do. Nevertheless, for another year, she did such incredible things that people came from far and near to see her skip over the church spire, or through the split oak tree in the Lord's Park, or across the river at its widest point. When there was trouble in her mother's house, or in any house in the village, Elsie Piddock skipped so gaily there was trouble forgotten in the laughter. And when she skipped all the old games in Glynde, along with the little girls, and they sang Andy Spandy, Sugary Candy, French Almond Rock, bread and butter for your supper, all your mother's got, Elsie Piddock said, "It aren't all I've got," and she gave them a suck on her skipping ropes all around. And on the night of the new moon, she always led the children up Mount Caburn, where she skipped more marvellously than ever. In fact, it was Elsie Piddock who started the custom of the new moon skipping on Caburn. But at the end of another year, she'd grown too big for her skipping rope. She laid it away in a box, and went on skipping with a longer one. She still skipped as never so, but her fairy tricks were laid by with the rope, and though her friends entreated her and to do marvellous things that she used to do, Elsie Piddock only laughed and shook her head and never told why. In time, when she was still the pride and wonder of the village, people would say, "Ah, but you should have seen her when she was a littling. Why, she could skip through her mother's keyhole." And in wartime, these stories became a legend that nobody believed. And in still more time, Elsie grew up, though never very much, and became a little woman, and gave up skipping because skipping time was over. After 50 years or so, nobody remembered that she had ever skipped at all. Only Elsie knew. For when times were hard, and they often were, she sat by the hearth with her dry crust and no butter, and sucked the sugar candy that Andy Spandy had given her for life. It was ever and ever so long afterwards. 3 new lords had walked in the park since the day Elsie Piddock had skipped through the split oak. Changes had come in the village. Old families had died out. New families had come. Others had moved away to distant parts. The Piddocks among them. Farms had changed hands. Cottages had been pulled down. New ones had been built. But Mount Caburn was as it had always been, and as the people came to think it always would be. And still the children had the custom of going up to skip the new moon in on Mount Caburn. Nobody remembered how this custom had come about. It was too far back in the years, but customs are customs. And the child who could not skip the new moon in on Caburn stayed home and cried. Then a new lord came to the park, and he was one who had grown rich in trade and bought the old estate. Soon after his coming, changes began to take place, more violent than pulling down cottages. The new lord began to shut up footpaths and destroy rights of way. He stole the common rights here and there as he could. In his greed for more than he had got, he raised rents and pressed people harder than they could bear. But bad as the high rents were to them, they did not mind these so much as the loss of their old rights. They fought the new lord, trying to keep what had been theirs for centuries. Sometimes they won the fight, but oftener they lost it. The constant quarrels bred a spirit of anger between them and the lord, and out of hate he was prepared to do whatever he could to spite them. Among the lands over which he exercised a certain power was Caburn. This had always been open to the people, and the lord determined if he could close it. Looking up the old deeds, he discovered that though the down was his, he was obliged to leave a way upon it by which the people could go from one village to another. For hundreds of years they had made a shortcut of it over the top. The lord's lawyer told him that by the wording of the deeds he could never stop the people travelling by way of the downs. Can't I? Snorted the Lord. Then at least I will make them travel a long way round. And he had plans drawn up to enclose the whole of the top of Mount Caburn, so the people could not walk on it. This meant the people must trudge miles around the base as they passed from place to place. The Lord gave out that he needed Mount Caburn to build great factories on. The village was up in arms to defend its rights. Can he do it? They asked. They asked those who knew, and they were told, "It's not quite certain, but we fear he can." The Lord himself was not quite certain either, but he went on with his plans, and each new move was watched with anger and anxiety by the villagers. And not only by the villagers, for the fairies saw their own skipping ground was threatened. How could they ever skip there again, when the grass was turned to cinders, and the new moon blackened by chimney smoke? The lawyer said to the Lord, "The people will fight you tooth and nail." "Let 'em," blustered the Lord, and he asked uneasily, "Have they a leg to stand on?" "Just half a leg," said the lawyer. "It would be as well not to begin building yet. And if you can come to terms, then you'd be better." The Lord sent word to the villagers that though he undoubtedly could do what he pleased, he would, out of his good heart, restore to them a footpath that he had blocked, if they would give up all pretensions to Caburn. "Footpath indeed!" cried stout John Multum among his cronies in the inn. "What's a footpath to Caburn? Why, our mothers skipped there as children, and our children skip there now, and we hope to see our children's children skip there. If Caburn top be built over, 'twill break my little Ellen's heart." "Ay, and my Marjorie's," said another. "And my Mary's, and my Kitty's," cried a third. Another spoke up, for nearly all had daughters, whose joy it was to skip on Caburn at the new moon. John Multum turned to their best adviser, who had studied the matter closely, and asked, "What do you think? Have we a leg to stand on?" "Only half a one," said the other. "I doubt if we can stop him. It might be as well to come to terms." "None of his footpaths for us," swore stout John Multum. "We'll fight the matter out." And so things went for quite a little while. And each side wondered what the next move would be. Only the people knew in their hearts they must be beaten in the end, and the Lord was sure of his victory. So sure that he had great loads of bricks ordered. But he did not begin building for fear the people might grow violent, and perhaps burn his ricks and destroy his property. The only thing he did was put a wire fence round the top of Caburn, and set a keeper there to send the people round it. The people broke the fence in many places, and jumped it, and crawled under it, and as the keeper could not be everywhere at once, many of them crossed the downs, almost under his nose. One evening, just before the new moon was due, Ellen Multman went into the woods to cry, for she was the best skipper under Mount Caburn. and the thought that she would never skip there again made her more unhappy than she'd ever thought she would be. While she was crying in the dark, she felt a hand on her shoulder, and a voice said to her, "Crying for trouble, my dear, that'll never do." The voice might have been the voice of a withered leaf. It was so light and dry, but it was also kind. So Ellen checked her sobs and said, "It's a big trouble, ma'am, and there's no remedy against it but to cry." "Why, yes there is," said the withered voice. "You should skip against trouble, my dear." At this Ellen's sobs burst forth anew. "I'll never skip no more," she wailed. "If I can't skip the new moon in on Caburn, I'll never skip no more." "And why can't you skip the new moon in on Caburn?" asked the voice. Then Ellen told her. After a little pause, the voice spoke quietly out of the darkness. "It's more than you will break their hearts if they cannot skip on Caburn. And it must not be. It must not be. Tell me your name." "Ellen Maltman, ma'am, and I do love skipping. I can skip down anybody, ma'am, and they say I skip as never so." "They do they?" said the withered voice. "Well, Ellen, run you home and tell them this. They are to go to the Lord and tell him he shall have his way and build on Caburn if he will first take down the fence and let all who have ever skipped there skip once more by turns at the new moon. All, mind you, Ellen. And when the last skipper skips, the last skip, he may lay his first brick, and let it be written out on paper, and signed, and sealed." "But, ma'am," said Ellen, wondering. "No words, child. Do as I tell you." And the withered voice sounded so compelling that Ellen resisted no more. She ran straight to the village and told her story to everybody. At first, they could hardly swallow it. Even when they had swallowed it, they said, "But what's the sense of it?" But Ellen persisted and persisted. Something of the spirit of the old voice got into her words, and against their reason, the people began to think that it was the thing to do. To cut a long story short, they sent the message to the Lord next day. The Lord could scarcely believe his ears. He rubbed his hands. He chortled at the people for fools. "They've come to terms," he sneered. "I shall have the down, and keep my footpath too. Well, they shall have their skipping party, and the moment it is ended, up go my factories." The paper was drawn out, signed by both parties in the presence of witnesses, and duly sealed, and on the night of the new moon, the Lord invited a party of his friends to go with him to Caburn to see the sight. And what a sight it was for them to see. Every little girl in the village was there with her skipping rope, from the toddlers to those who just turned up their hair. Nay, even the grown maidens and the young mothers were there, and the very matrons too had come with ropes. Had not they once, as children, skipped on Caburn, and had the message not said all? Yes, and others were there, others that they could not see. Andy Spandy and his fairy team, Heels a-Lead, Flea-Foot, and all of the rest were gathered round to watch with bright, fierce eyes the last great skipping on their precious ground. The skipping began. The toddlers first, a skip or so apiece, a stumble and they fell out. The Lord and his party laughed aloud at the comical mites, and at another time the villagers would have laughed too. But there was no laughter in them tonight. Their eyes were bright and fierce like those of the fairies. After the toddlers, the little girls skipped in the order of their ages, and as they got older, the skipping got better. In the thick of the school children, "This will take some time," said the Lord impatiently. And when Ellen Maltman's turn came, and she went into her thousands, he grew restive. But even she, who could skip as never so, tired at last, her foot tripped, and she fell on the ground with a little sob. None lasted even half her time. Of those who followed, some were better, some were worse, and some, in the small hours, the older women were beginning to take their turn. Few of them kept it up for half a minute. They hopped and puffed bravely, but their skipping days were done. As they had laughed at the babies, so now the Lord's friends jibed at the babies' grandmothers. "Soon over now," said the Lord, as the oldest of the women who had come to skip, a fat old dame of 67, stepped out and twirled her rope. Her foot caught on it. She staggered, dropped the rope, and hid her face in her hands. "Done!" shouted the Lord, and he brandished at the crowd a trowel and a brick which he had brought with him. "Clear out, you lot! I'm going to lay the first brick. The skipping's ended." "No, if you please," said a gentle, wizard voice. "It's my turn now." And out of the crowd stepped a tiny little woman, so very old, so very bent and fragile, that she seemed to be no bigger than a little child. "You?" cried the Lord. "Who are you?" "My name is Elsie Piddock, if you please, and I am 109 years old. For the last 79 years I've lived over the border, but I was born in Glynde, and I skipped on Caburn as a child." She spoke like one in a dream, and her eyes were closed. "Elsie Piddock! Elsie Piddock!" The name ran in whispers round the crowd. "Elsie Piddock!" murmured Ellen Maltman. Why, Mum, I thought Elsie Piddock was just a tale." "Nay, Elsie Piddock was no tale," said the fat woman who had skipped last. "My mother Joan skipped with her many a time and told me tales you'd never believe." "Elsie Piddock!" they all breathed again, and a wind seemed to fly round Mount Caburn, shrilling the name with glee. But it was no wind. It was Andy Spandy and his fairy team, for they had seen the skipping rope in the tiny woman's hands. One of the handles was made of sugar candy, and the other was made of French almond rock. But the new Lord had never even heard of Elsie Piddock as a story. So, laughing coarsely once again, he said, One more bump for an old woman's bones. Skip, Elsie Piddock, and show us what you're worth. Yes, skip, Elsie Piddock, cried Andy Spandy and the fairies, and show them what you're worth. Then Elsie Piddock stepped into the middle of the onlookers. She twirled her baby rope over her little shrunken body and began to skip. And she skipped as never so. First of all she skipped Andy Spandy Sugary Candy, French Almond Rock. Bread and butter for your supper's all your mother's got. And nobody could find fault with her skipping. Even the Lord gasped, "Wonderful, wonderful for an old woman." But Ellen Maltman, who knew, whispered, "Oh, Mum, 'tis wonderful for anybody. And oh, Mum, but do see, she's skipping in her sleep." It was true. Elsie Piddock, shrunk to the size of a 7-year-old, was sound asleep, skipping the new moon in with her baby rope that was up to all the tricks. An hour went by, 2 hours, 3 hours. There was no stopping her, and no tiring her. The people gasped. The Lord fumed, and the fairies turned head over heels for joy. When morning broke, the Lord cried, "That's enough," but Elsie Piddock went on skipping. "Time's up," cried the Lord. "When I skip my last skip, you shall lay your first brick," said Elsie Piddock. The villagers broke into a cheer. "Signed and sealed, my lord, signed and sealed," said Elsie Piddock. "But hang it, old woman, can't go on forever," cried the Lord. "Oh, yes, I can," said Elsie Piddock, and on she went. At midday, the Lord shouted, "Will the woman never stop?" "No, she won't," said Elsie Piddock. And she didn't. "Then I'll stop you," stormed the Lord, and made a grab at her. "Now for the sly skip," said Elsie Piddock, and skipped right through his thumb and forefinger. "Hold her, you!" yelled the Lord at his lawyer. "Now for the high skip," said Elsie Piddock, as the lawyer darted at her. She skipped right over the highest lark, singing in the sun. The villagers shouted for glee, and the Lord and his friends were furious. Forgotten was the compact signed and sealed. Their one thought now was to seize the maddening old woman and stop her skipping by sheer force. But they couldn't. She played all her tricks on them. High skip, slow skip, sly skip, toe skip, long skip, fast skip, strong skip, but never last skip. On and on she went. When the sun began to set, she was still skipping. "Can we never rid the down of the old thing?" cried the Lord desperately. "No," said Elsie Piddock in her sleep. "The down will never be rid of me more. It's the children of Glynd I'm skipping for, to hold the down for them and theirs forever. It's Andy Spandy I'm skipping for once again, for through him I've sucked sweet all my life. Oh, Andy, even you never knew how long Elsie Piddock could go on skipping. The woman's mad, cried the Lord. Signed and sealed doesn't hold with a mad woman. Skip or no skip, I shall lay the first brick. And he plunged his trowel into the ground and forced his brick down into the hole as a token of his possession of the land. Now, said Elsie, for a strong skip. Right on top of the brick she skipped, and down underground she sunk out of sight. Bearing the brick beneath her. Wild with rage, the Lord dived after her. Up came Elsie Piddock, skipping blither than ever, but the Lord never came up again. The lawyer ran to look down the hole, but there was no sign of him. The lawyer reached his arm down the hole, but there was no reaching him. The lawyer dropped a pebble down the hole, but no one heard it fall. So strong had Elsie Piddock skipped the strong skip. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders, and he and the Lord's friends left Mount Caburn for good and all. Oh, how joyously Elsie Piddock skipped then. Skip against trouble, cried she, and skipped so that everyone present burst into happy laughter. To the tune of it, she skipped the long skip, clean out of sight. And the people went home to tea. Caburn was saved for their children and for the fairies forever. But that wasn't the end of Elsie Piddock. She has never stopped skipping on Caburn since. For signed and sealed is signed and sealed. Not many have seen her, because she knows all the tricks. But if you go to Caburn at the new moon, I was there yesterday, you may catch a glimpse of a tiny bent figure, no bigger than a child, skipping all by itself in its sleep, and hear a gay little voice like the voice of a dancing yellow leaf singing, Andy Spandy, sugar-de candy, French almond rock, bread and butter for your suppers, all your mother's got. And that is the end.